history. Sorry I can't make it today. I was not planning on being home from school, but we will make do and we're going to get everything done today that we intended to do, whether I was there or not. So hope your day is going well. You should have just finished the World War I documentary, or the Russian Revolution documentary video, and answered the questions that are on page 56. And now that you've done that and completed your guided notes on the Russian Revolution for homework last night, our goal today is to put it all together to help you really understand the Russian Revolution and its impact on World War I and the history that follows. Due tomorrow is an introduction to how the war ends. Our goal tomorrow is to get this war ended and then take your World War I quiz at the end of class. So on Haiku, I've posted a case study on the Versailles Treaty, which is the treaty that ends the war, and I'll show you where that's at the end of this video. But for now, if you don't have your workbooks still out, grab them and turn to page 57. That's what we're going to work on together right now, and I'm going to show you what you need to do. Okay, so now that you're turned to page 57, you can see this chart, which should be somewhat familiar to you. Maybe you remember looking at this for the Reformation and the French Revolution. And we're going to use it today to compare the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. We're halfway through the semester, and that means we're halfway to the final exam, so it's never too early to review. So hopefully this is also a really good review of the French Revolution and also helps you understand the Russian Revolution better. So I'm going to walk you through half of it, help you review the French Revolution, and then you're going to use these two resources, the Russian Revolution documentary notes and your guided notes from last night, to complete the bottom part of the chart with a little bit of help. So page 57 is where we're at. Okay, so we're going to start with looking at that first column, the institutional problem. So your question is, which institution was being challenged in this revolution, and what were the perceived or real problems with this institution? In other words, we're looking at the causes of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And both of them have essentially four causes: a political, social, economic, and intellectual or ideological cause. So you can go ahead and label those two boxes in that row, but leave some space to take a little bit of notes on each one. Okay, so let's start with the political causes. And we can start with the same exact government that both of these countries have on the eve of their revolutions, which is an absolute monarchy. So you might remember that King Louis XVI was the absolute monarch of France. He was a divine right absolute monarchy, which means people believed that he had unchecked or unlimited power that came directly from God. He did have a legislative body, the Estates General, that he was supposed to consult, but the reality was, in an absolute monarchy, you just don't. You call the shots without anybody interfering. The same exact system existed in Russia during World War I. So we've got Tsar Nicholas II, and the video in your notes last night continuously referred to him as an autocrat or an autocratic ruler. That's the exact same thing as an absolute monarch. And as we saw from the video yesterday, Tsar Nicholas II also believed that his power came from God to rule. So in a lot of ways, these two men, Louis XVI and Nicholas II, are really comparable. Not only in their power, but also in their personalities. They were both known to be very nice, kind men, but didn't quite have the forceful personality needed to lead their country through crisis. And they both made really bad decisions as a result. You might remember that when the revolution started in France, King Louis XVI sent troops to Paris to keep safety. But this just convinced the people that he was ready to attack them, so his deeds were misinterpreted. Similarly, Tsar Nicholas II, during World War I, decides to leave the government in St. Petersburg and go directly to the front to lead the troops. But this did not prove to be very inspiring leadership for them, and as they continuously lost battles, it fell more and more on his shoulders alone. So in that sense, the power of the monarchy was starting to decline. So not only can we compare the political causes, but we can also compare some of the social causes of these revolutions. So, in France, you might remember that a big social problem was the estate system. And the estate system was based on dividing society into three groups called estates. And each group had a different legal system. So, the first estate was the clergy, and the second estate was the nobility. And they had a lot of privileges and exemptions. For example, they didn't need to pay very many taxes. And the third estate, which was everybody else, the burden of taxation was falling completely on them. And that third estate group included a whole range of people, from well-educated elites called bourgeoisie to the poorest of peasants. So they felt this system was really unjust. In Russia, they're also dealing with this problem of a huge peasant population that was really impoverished. Like in France, there was a very large gap between the rich and the poor, which gives people a sense of deep inequality in their society. On top of that, the social effects of World War I on Russian society were awful. Casualty rates were very, very high. The video mentioned that 3/4 of soldiers were casualties of war during World War I. So, of course, as people's brothers and husbands and sons aren't returning, this creates a lot of social issues in Russia. So here's an image that you might remember from the French Revolution of the three estates, the depiction of the member of the third estate suffering under the weight of the first and second estate. And here's an image of a Russian peasant from around the time of World War I. And you get a sense of the poverty that they're living in. Very shabby clothing, not very well clothed or well housed. And there was big health problems among the Russian peasants as well. So similar social issues. And thirdly, economic issues. So in France, there's a financial crisis. And in Russia, there's also a financial crisis that leads both of these countries right to the brink of a revolution. The financial crisis in France was caused by two things. One, a really poorly timed famine. And that meant that the crops and the harvest weren't growing. And the bread prices, because of a shortage of wheat, were going way, way up. And on top of that, the government is in increasing debt from fighting all of these wars. For example, you might remember that the French helped the United States fight in the American Revolution. And so the government is seeking more and more taxes in order to keep the government running. But the people that they're taxing, the third estate, are becoming poorer, and they don't have that money to pay their taxes. The financial crisis in Russia is caused immediately by World War I, but has a lot of similar effects. So Russia just isn't industrialized enough to meet the demands of total war, and that war of attrition that all came down to the number of guns and bullets and soldiers that you can bring to the front to wear your enemy down. So this causes a great economic crisis in this somewhat industrialized country, and it leads to shortages for people on the home front, not enough people working in the fields as they're moved to factories, which causes a food famine, and workers under really poor conditions and without food begin to strike. So the financial crisis in both cases is really debilitating for the country. So at the top, you see what changes in the price of wheat in France. So as a result of famine and the shortage that it causes, the price of wheat skyrockets. People can't afford food anymore. Similarly, you see at the bottom Russian wheat harvests and potato harvests. And during those red years, the years of 1914 to 1918, the supply of food is going way down. And of course, that's going to cause the same inflation that happened in France. Okay, finally, we've got some inspiration from new ideas about government that inspire revolutionary leaders to challenge the existing government and eventually overthrow it. In France, that intellectual or ideological change was the Enlightenment. And in Russia, the new political ideology is Marxism. The Enlightenment in France was a movement by the philosophes many years earlier, and many of those philosophes or philosophers were promoting the idea that all people were born with natural rights. This is the basis of what we call liberalism today. And therefore, there shouldn't be any inequality under the law. There should be no estate system. All people should be equal under the law. Marxism, you might remember from our Industrial Revolution unit, Marx promoted the idea of a proletariat revolution. He believed that in an industrial society, capitalists or factory owners were exploiting the people, which led to this great inequality. And the people were being exploited, the workers, they were called the proletariat. And Marx said eventually that proletariat is going to rise up and overthrow the government and overthrow the capitalists and take control of the economy for themselves. It would be a workers-run economy. And the leader that's particularly inspired by Marxism leading up to World War I in Russia is Lenin, who we'll talk about in a little bit. So we can kind of compare the philosophical roots of these new political ideas that challenge the old established order of absolute monarchy, and then the revolutionary leaders like Danton and Lenin who take those ideas and put them into action to create a revolution. All right, so now we're ready to start talking about the revolutions themselves. And you might remember that when we came to revolutionary agendas and action steps, what we did is we divided those boxes in two. Because revolutionary agendas are different comparing the elites and what they wanted out of the revolution and common people and what they wanted. And the difference between the elites and the common people and their agendas is what ultimately produces two different phases of each revolution. So the French Revolution was really kind of two revolutions, one after the other. The same exact thing is going to happen in Russia. We've got elites and common people with different agendas and therefore two phases of the revolution. So you can go ahead on page 57, take a moment, press pause, divide your charts this way, and then I'm going to walk you through the French Revolution and leave it to you to use your notes to do the Russian Revolution. Okay, so now that you have your divisions made, let's review the French Revolution. So keep in mind that the intentions of the elites are what always caused the first revolution, and what the intentions of the common people always cause a much more radical second revolution. The elites of the French Revolution were called the bourgeoisie. Those were members of the Third Estate who were super well educated, doctors, lawyers, and they had been reading all of the Enlightenment philosophes. So their agenda was to create an enlightened, updated government. They wanted everyone to be equal under the law, and ultimately that meant putting limits on the power of the monarch, establishing a constitutional monarchy. And that constitution, as a document, would guarantee people their rights. However, the common people, who were peasants, they had very different ideas. Really, what they wanted more than anything else was a secure supply of food. They also felt really oppressed by taxation, so they were interested in a fair taxation system, and they ultimately wanted to lower the gap between the rich and the poor. They obviously wanted to increase their station in life. So the first phase of the revolution reflects the interests of those elite bourgeoisie, and we call it the liberal phase. And the liberal phase changed the legal system of France to make it a constitutional monarchy and to make everyone equal under the law. You might remember that this started with the tennis court oath. King Louis XVI called all the members of the Estates General and the three estates together, but they couldn't agree on what to do about taxation. So members of the Third Estate left that meeting and declared that they would meet until they wrote a constitution for France, which they did, the Constitution of 1791. We analyzed this image of this really important event, and you might remember right at the bottom in the center were these three people coming together. There's a member of the clergy on the left, there's a member of nobility on the right, and a member of the Third Estate bringing them together. And that indicates that some members of the First and Second Estates also agreed with these changes. However, you might also remember that around this same time, common people are starting to take action on their own. They're storming the Bastille prison, looking for weapons to defend themselves against the king's troops. The women are marching to Versailles, demanding cheaper prices of bread. So the common people are starting to take action with their own agenda as well. And it's those action steps that lead to the radical phase of the French Revolution. So in addition to the storming of the Bastille and the Women's March on Versailles, the radical phase of the French Revolution ended up executing the king, which they're left with a legislative body and a constitution that makes them now a republic. But they also get themselves into a civil war. There's a lot of counter-revolutionaries who don't want France to be a republic. That idea was just too radical for them at the time. So the government of the radical phase, led by Robespierre, starts the Reign of Terror, the civil war against counter-revolutionaries, where anyone who was accused of being a counter-revolutionary was sent to the guillotine and executed. Now we know where this ends up in France. Robespierre himself is eventually executed. There's a weak government that replaces him. And ultimately what happens is France winds up under the power of Napoleon, who takes power in a coup d'etat, which is a military overthrow of the government. He makes himself emperor, and he rules somewhat as a tyrant, but with some liberal ideas. Keep that in mind because we can compare it to Russia. Now, speaking of comparing things to Russia, you're ready to do that right now. I'm going to give you a little bit of help establishing the topics of each of these places on your chart, and then you're going to go to your notes and your video questions to fill in the rest. So, our groups. Our elites in Russia on the eve of the Russian Revolution are the exact same group as the French Revolution, these well-educated middle-class bourgeoisie. The common people are also peasants who make up the bulk of Russian society, but they're also joined by the workers in the factories and also the soldiers who are fighting in World War I. So here's a question that can help guide the information you put in that first box. What kind of government did those elites want? The middle class individuals. Feel free to go back to the rating if you don't find that in your notes from last night. Second question is, what were the demands that peasants and workers had that led them to go on all these strikes during World War I? The agenda of the elites is what causes the first phase of the Russian Revolution, which is the establishment of a provisional government. So this is called the February Revolution. It actually happened in March on our calendar, but Russia was using a different calendar at the time. So what action from the Tsar ended up causing the February Revolution that established the provisional government? And any actions taken by the provisional government, include them in that box. So what were the decisions specifically of this guy Kerensky and the Mensheviks? What were the decisions that they were making to try to lead this government into stability? But ultimately, the second phase of the revolution reflects the needs of the common people, and we call this the Bolshevik Revolution. It's sometimes called the October Revolution as well. And so the question for this box is, what did Lenin promise his people? And how did he go about gaining control over the government? Ultimately, Russia will wind up in the hands of this guy, who we'll talk much more about tomorrow. So some general things that you want to look for, similarities to look for as you fill out the bottom row of this chart. Commonalities between the agendas of elites and common people. They should seem very similar to you, but of course they should be a little bit different because we're talking about two revolutions that were over 100 years apart from each other. Think about the key role of women's protests in starting a revolution as well. There's a good comparison to be made. There is an element of civil war against counter-revolutionaries in both. Make sure you know the two sides of the civil war for the Russian Revolution and who won and why. And then finally, tomorrow we're going to talk through the style of leadership that emerges after the revolution's end. We know it ends up with Napoleon in France. We got to figure out who ends up in power in Russia or the Soviet Union at the end of the Russian Revolution. If you do have any time left over after that, go ahead and get started on your homework. Here's where it is, posted right on the home page or the World War I and Russian Revolution page of Haiku. It's posted in the upper right. It's called the Versailles Treaty Case Study. It's one of those multiple choice case studies that we will go over to tomorrow to discuss the end of the war. All right, thanks guys. Work hard today and I will see you tomorrow.